We can get started.
Okay, thank you. Dean Payne?
Welcome, everyone. I'm Steve Payne, Dean of the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America. This is the first of two online webinars, continuing the discussion we began last year as a predicate to our upcoming conference on business accountability for human rights, addressing human rights issues in global supply chains. That conference, which is organized by the Columbus School of Law in collaboration with Paul Hastings, LLP, will take place here in Washington, D.C. on April 7th and 8th, 2022. We're working with experts from around the world to help shine a light on the plight of some of the world's most vulnerable people and to explore ways in which the private and public sectors can work together for a better future for them and for the global economy. We're delighted that you're with us today. We've got a lot going on at the law school, and this is undoubtedly one of my favorite projects. Today's program will offer an overview of human rights issues in global supply chains with a particular focus on labor exploitation and ideas for how business, governments, and NGOs can work together to stop the human suffering created by modern-day slavery, human trafficking, and other forms of labor exploitation. Our moderators are Professor Sarah Duggan and Ms. Renata Parras. As a member of our faculty, Sarah directs our Compliance Investigations and Corporate Responsibility Program, and Renata is the Global Pro Bono Counsel of Paul Hastings, LLP. Again, thank you very much for joining us. It's an outstanding panel, and I'll turn it over to Sarah to introduce them.
Thanks so much, Dean Payne, and thanks to all of you joining us online today. It's a wonderful array of people who've signed up to join this program, and we look forward to your input. Welcome. So this is the first of our business accountability programs held in collaboration with Paul Hastings, LLP, and we're particularly grateful to Tara Junta, CUA alumna and vice chair of the firm's investigations and white collar defense practice, as well as co-chair of the firm's Global Diversity Council, and to my co-moderator, Renata Parras, who, as Dean Payne noted, is the firm's Global Pro Bono Counsel and a former Deputy Chief Counsel of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where she worked on a number of issues, but especially human rights. I want to say a quick thanks too to the CUA team who have helped create this program, including Constantia Dedoulis, Joe Ferraro, Al Washington, Jillian Salazzo, and my colleague, Senior Associate Dean Mary Graw-Leary, and our alumna Carmita Hedman-Sekira, and the person who is making this whole program possible, even as we speak, Emily Sobieski. Thanks to all of you. As we've noted in earlier discussions, the United Nations estimates that some 40 million people, including 29 million women and children, are caught in the chains of modern-day slavery throughout the world. And many of those people are contributing their labor to global supply chains that bring so many of us life's necessities, our comforts, and even our luxuries. Some weave cloth, some stitch our clothing, others mine the minerals we need for our cell phones and laptops that become essential to our daily lives. Some harvest the seafood we think brings good health, or they gather the cocoa beans for the chocolate we love to eat. And still others labor to produce the sports facilities that host major world events, such as the World Cup of Soccer. These vulnerable workers not only struggle for physical sustenance, clothing, and shelter, but they sometimes lack the most basic human freedoms. Too many are children who spend their days working rather than learning and playing. Too many give up hope for an education and a decent life. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated their plight, even as it has created grave new dangers for the world and put extraordinary pressures on global supply chains. There's no question that we all want to be rid of this terrible situation, but too often we fail to make the connections between our lives and our work and these global tragedies. Sometimes we just don't know what to do. And that's where our expert panelists come in today. It is absolutely wonderful to have them here with us. They are distinguished experts in the field, and they're going to offer their insights on business and human rights. The Honorable Kevin Highland, the Order of the British Empire, is a globally recognized expert on modern-day slavery and forced labor. He has 30 years of experience in law enforcement, and he was the United Kingdom's first independent anti-slavery commissioner. He's also the author of United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 8.7, which is a call to eradicate modern-day slavery, forced labor, and child labor. Mr. Highland chairs the Institute of Human Rights and Business Responsible Recruitment Group. He's a member of the Council of Europe's group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings, and he is the chief advisor to the Santa Marta Group, a high-level partnership among law enforcement agencies, faith groups, and civil society endorsed by Pope Francis. The Honorable John Cotton Richmond is currently a partner in the Denton's Law Firm's Federal Regulatory and Compliance Practice. Prior to joining Denton's, Mr. Richmond served as the U.S. Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. And it's the United States' highest ranking position dedicating to eliminating human trafficking. Mr. Richmond has spent his career at the intersection of law, policy, and human rights as a federal prosecutor, as founding director of the Human Trafficking Institute, director of the International Justice Mission, and as an ambassador. He has extensive experience in many areas, including ESG and supply chains. And finally, Mr. John Yeager is Vice President, Legal, Regulatory, and Trade Compliance of Toyota Tsusho, the America Inc., Toyota Tsusho America Inc., or TAI. Mr. Yeager's North American operations responsibilities include ISO 14001 leadership and monitoring, environmental, social, and governance, or ESG responsibilities, carbon neutrality and sustainability priorities, regulatory and trade compliance. He's a member of TAI's Enterprise and Risk Management Committee, and he deals with issues ranging from environmental matters to supply chain security, logistics, and transportation support. He is a contributor to and plays a leadership role with respect to TAI's Code of Conduct and Ethics standards. Thank you. It's an honor to have you here today, and thank you so much for joining us. Now, for all of us gathered, we'll begin with an overview of some brief remarks from each of our panelists and then turn to discussion questions. The final segment of today's program will be devoted to questions from all of you joining us here today. We're going to use the Q&A tool rather than the chat function for questions. So as we begin, please open the Q&A function on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen so that you'll be ready to type in your questions into the Q&A box as they arise. So with that, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to offer brief opening remarks. And Mr. Hyland, if we can start with you.
So good evening to everybody here from a dark wet evening in Ireland. But thank you, Dean Payne, for allowing this event to take place. And especially thank you to you, Sarah, for all you're doing to promote this issue, and to your team at the university. And it's great to be amongst such good panelists and organization who are putting this together. But when we are talking about the issue of human rights and supply chains and human trafficking, we have to really go back to what this breach is and what it's about. If we look at the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, this crime, and we have to remember that it is a crime, breaches so many of those rights. Whether it's Article 1, we're all born free, whether it's Article 4, which is about slavery, Article 7 about the law applying equally, and many more, like the right to move freely in Article 13, the right to marry, the right to free speech. All of those go once somebody ends up in exploitation and a victim of human trafficking. So the intersection with business and human rights couldn't be closer because, as we know, so many of these crimes happen within the business sector. You've explained that to us. And so much money is generated by that. Some of it knowingly, some of it unknowingly or unwittingly. But I think that's where we need to change that. We make excuses for this. We make excuses for people who commit crimes. And I would like to draw an analogy that a very big internet company was recently fined in Ireland in the last month for breach of data protection. And the fine they got for exposing data, and there was no real harm done. There wasn't somebody who ended up losing their freedom, but the company was fined 225 million euros. When we look at breaches that are of emissions, for example, vehicles in the US that came from Europe, where the emissions were altered, it was multi-billions worth of fines. But when we talk about human trafficking and the exploitation and the human rights element, we see that actually the sanctions do not exist in many parts of the world. Now that will change in Germany, for example, where they are bringing in a 4% tariff, as it were, if it's found that human rights breaches happen in companies that operate over 466 million euros. And so there will be sanctions and they will start to reduce. But I think cooperation, I think an understanding of this, perhaps that's why we're not getting the full traction, that we're not talking about this for what it is. We kind of talk about it as if it's an inevitability, as if it's just something that has to happen in society because it's there and it's too difficult to deal with. Look at the things we are talking about dealing with in the world. Climate. Now, of course, there are people who are climate deniers, but generally the world is convinced that climate needs to change. That is a massive task. And yet, it's not always a crime. This is a crime, and yet people get away with it. So we need to start looking at this more like we look at the use of our data, the use of when we're doing something. When we get on an aircraft, we want it to be safe. We want regulations about the road, the cars we drive, the products we buy. But how come we're not saying exactly the same about the people who are involved in producing those, making those, and the companies involved there? And I think that's the biggest failing, is that we aren't looking at this as we look at ourselves, because it's other people, people who are in poverty, and that's the fact of it, that their human rights are being breached. And does anyone really care? If we do, and businesses do, then we will see traction. But I'm afraid very often traction only comes when there is regulation. And we will see that happen, and we're seeing it happen with the US Tariff Act. We've seen enormous change in companies. We've seen change in Australia, where their legislation is starting to have some impact. We're seeing it in the UK, albeit the legislation is fairly weak. We're seeing it in France, as they've now got transparency legislation, and we'll be very interested to see what happens with Germany. But we do need something to happen, and it can only come by honesty, transparency, and understanding and accepting the problem. So thank you very much, Sarah.
Sarah, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Mr. Richmond, would you go ahead?
Thank you, Sarah. I'm grateful to Dean Payne, Sarah, for you and Renata for putting this together, and for Catholic Law School for hosting this conversation about what I think is one of the most interesting topics in the human rights space, and particularly in the anti-trafficking space right now. When we think about business accountability or corporate accountability for forced labor and sex trafficking, I would say that the legal landscape is changing by the week. We're getting new information on a regular basis and seeing laws change and the application of those really shift. And I want to back up a moment to what Kevin was emphasizing, that it is important for us to remember that it is a crime. And more importantly, it's an economic crime. That is, the primary motivation of every trafficker is economic. They may have other motivations as well, but I think it's important to keep the trafficker in the sentence. There were several studies that were done about the domestic violence awareness movement for years. And they had a construction about their awareness campaigns that I think we could learn from in the anti-trafficking role. And that is that what started off as domestic violence and awareness started off with a simple sentence construction of Jack beat Jane. And then the next construction would be Jane was beaten by Jack. We moved to the passive voice and we put the actor Jack at the end of the sentence. The third version is Jane was beaten and Jack is completely deleted from the sentence. And then the fourth and final shift is Jane is a battered woman. And now what Jack did, the crime that Jack committed, is transitioned into an identity statement about who Jane is. We've seen the same progression in many of the awareness materials in the anti-trafficking space, where the traffickers get deleted from the sentence, and we personify trafficking as if it's a disembodied menace that is just out there, that people fall into trafficking as if they were tripping and falling into a pothole. Indeed, every trafficking situation has a trafficker, a human trafficker, and it has a human victim. And I think we need to remember and keep at the front of our minds that every one of these individuals matter. That just as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Kevin mentioned stated that everyone has inherent value, that is value that precedes government, does not spring from it, and for which governments cannot infringe. And I think that's an important point as we're seeing a burden shifting. As we're seeing a burden shifting from government to business to deal with human rights. And in many ways, I think it's a reflection of the fact that governments have underperformed their international and domestic obligations to stop traffickers and to care in a trauma-informed way for survivors. And they're, in a sense, shifting that burden to businesses to deal with human rights issues. And I think there are 3 public sector initiatives right now that are worth examining in greater detail, but I'll just touch on them here. The first is countries banning the importation of goods made in whole or part by forced labor. We saw in 2015 an amendment to our 1930 Tariff Act in the United States spawn a bunch of withhold release orders. That is pulling back and not allowing shipments to unload their goods if we just have probable cause that they are tainted with forced labor. Our challenge is it's hard to have a true governance architecture around it. We don't know who to appeal those to. We go back to Customs and Border Protection and ask them to release the withhold release order whenever we can. It has had a big impact on the way companies think, and it's created a new sense of risk and motivating those companies to make sure that their supply chains are free of forced labor. The other is we've seen a whole new group of benefiting financially cases. That is, there's 2 theories of liability under the United States Trafficking Victims Protection Act. One is to affirmatively or directly engage in trafficking activities. But there's another theory of liability, which is just if you benefit financially or otherwise from engaging in a trafficking venture, then you can also be held civilly or criminally liable. And we're now seeing companies being sued civilly in federal courts around the United States for having forced labor in their supply chains. And some of those suits are now making it beyond the motion to dismiss stage, creating another new risk for businesses. So one is the importation bans, another is the benefiting cases. The third public sector initiative that I think is going to make a big splash, and Kevin already highlighted it, it's the new German mandatory human rights due diligence law. The EU passed a resolution in March around the same idea. It's going to take some time for these laws to take full effect, but we're really shifting from a disclosure framework that was under the California Transparency Act and the UK and Australian Modern Slavery Acts. They basically have a disclosure framework where companies have to report. They have to say what, if anything, they're doing to deal with forced labor in their supply chain. We're leaving the waters of disclosure to the dry land of diligence. So now companies are mandated to map their supply chains. They have to look through, and they have to verify that their supply chains do not have forced labor in them. This is a massive burden shifting. And as that new law in Germany comes online January 1, 2023, it will apply to all companies with 3,000 employees or more, and then it drops down to 1,000 in 2024. So we're seeing a lot of new emphasis about how to push in on companies to be responsible for human rights abuses within their supply chains. I think it's a developing area of law, and it's just fascinating to get to work with my colleagues at Dentons, who are some incredible leaders thinking about how to help companies navigate through these changing waters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Yeager?
Thank you. And that was actually, I enjoyed the comments from Kevin and John on this matter. From my perspective, I'm coming from the business side, and some of the things that John is referring to are some of the things that our company has to contemplate daily with human rights, now with sustainability. These issues are very important also with supply chain security, dealing with customs. We are having to now vet our entire supply chain to make sure that they are free of any types of violations, and human rights is one of those key areas. One of the things that we would like to see that it's been a difficulty is a better transparency in Department of Labor and some of the bad actors of being able to much easier identify those companies. There doesn't seem to be that transparency. And then our research, there's a lot of companies like ourselves who I would deem as a good actor that is doing the right things, that have good policies in place, but the intelligence tools to find and determine these is very difficult when you have very complicated supply chains where you have thousands and thousands of suppliers in your supply chains and suppliers that they're using. We need better tools and communication in which to identify these bad actors. One of the other things, it's very important, like outreach events like these, it's extremely important to have these open and honest discussions, because if we're not having these discussions, we're not going to solve these problems. I don't have all the answers, but I know all of us here can have ideas that can help us to resolve these issues, because I don't think any company wants to have any human rights violations in their supply chain, not only from a brand protection, it's just not good business, and it's not good all the way around, and want to do the things to eliminate this entirely from our supply chains.
Thank you. And now let me turn it over to you, Renata, so that you can begin our discussion questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to each of you for your opening remarks. It's really my absolute honor to be here today with these esteemed colleagues and panelists. As most of you know, I myself spent my entire career prior to coming to Paul Hastings with the U.S. government, where I worked primarily on human rights issues. And the topic of public-private partnerships and how they can be utilized to help eradicate human rights abuses is really a topic that is very near and dear to my own heart. So I am really pleased to be here today and have a really great discussion. I want to remind each of the panelists while we're going through our questions that you are absolutely welcome to interrupt me at any time, especially if you want to reply to one of your fellow panelists' remarks and I've moved on to another question. And I encourage really the most honest, open dialogue that we can have here today in anticipation of using today really as a precursor for our event in April and how we may use some of our thoughts today as a real call to action for our April conference. So without further delay, we'll dive right in. As I said, I worked for the U.S. government for over a decade and concentrated on human rights abuses. And my career is absolutely dwarfed by those of you who are joining me today on the panel who have dedicated your entire careers to this. Many governments, United Nations, NGOs, faith groups, business leaders have called for an end to human rights abuses in global supply chains, particularly modern day slavery, and in particular labor exploitation. So why then is this such a pervasive and such a persistent problem? Former Commissioner Hyland, you touched on this in your opening remarks, and I'm going to start with you.
Yes, thank you, Renata. Well, I think the reason is, as John Richmond said, it is a very lucrative crime. It is an economic crime. So it's one that people choose to do. And because there is very little resistance globally with, such low numbers of people being prosecuted, again, because as John Richmond said, we don't talk enough about the perpetrator, and it's almost as if they don't exist. And those perpetrators can be, as we know, sometimes it can be state-sponsored, sometimes it can be connected to terrorism, sometimes it can be big business that is turning a blind eye. So it's controlled in a very open and unchallenged way. And that can happen, though, when we look at it even at the level of the industry, that sometimes, law enforcement will look at it as being something that's terribly difficult. And that was my background as law enforcement. Well, actually, when you put the resources in, when you lose the detectives and the victims' crimes teams in the same way as you do for other crime, you would be surprised how frequently you will get convictions. So I think it's one where it's been made, it is a complex issue, but sometimes the responses make it more complex instead of looking at it through a very clear lens. And I also think that there isn't the investment in it. that there's a lot of commitments at UN level, EU level, and at national levels. But when you look globally, estimates put this at around 150 billion US dollars a year generated for criminals, and how much is actually invested by OECD countries. And I'm pretty sure we wouldn't go near even 1% of that globally actually invested. So, it's an unfair fight.
Mr. Richmond, can you reply to that as a former prosecutor? Do you agree with what Mr. Hyland has said?
I do. I think to put it a different way, I don't think traffickers listen to or care what the UN or NGOs or faith groups or business leaders have to say. Those calls fall on deaf ears to the traffickers. The traffickers are thinking about risks and rewards. And as Kevin said, when they look at the reward side of the equation, the reward is high. $150.2 billion a year in gross revenues is what the UN has estimated are the global profits for human trafficking. So it's high reward and it's incredibly low risk. The number of prosecutions reported by governments around the world has fallen 48% since 2015. You might think, well, that means there's less trafficking out there. But during that same time period, the number of victims governments reported identifying increased 40%. So the number of victims being identified is going way up, and the number of traffickers being held accountable is going way down. So traffickers, whether, as Kevin said, they could be governments and state sanctioned forced labor, it could be businesses, small or large, it could be individuals. They are looking at this and seeing high reward, low risk. They're seeing governments not working to identify them or stop them from harming others. And so they continue to choose to commit this crime. In many ways, traffickers operate with impunity, and that it will continue to be a crime until that shifts. Another explanation for why it's so pervasive is just the mass amount of vulnerability. We just had a report from the head of the United Nations World Food Program, who happened to win the Nobel Peace Prize last year for all of their successful efforts. He estimated that over 500 million people are going to be pushed into global poverty who were not already in poverty because of the global shutdown orders in response to COVID-19. So the number of vulnerable people is increasing. And we know that traffickers want to target people who are vulnerable because traffickers believe they're easier to control and compel. And so that could also be an explanation of why the crime is so pervasive.
That is an excellent segue into what my next question was actually going to be, which is we see all of these international bodies, individual businesses, United Nations Human Rights Council, really engaging in major efforts to attempt to eradicate these human rights abuses. Do you think these measures are working? And I think, John, you've just really hit on maybe not, right? Because we're looking at the problem wrong. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think they're working in the sense that they're absolutely necessary, right? Like we need global instruments, we need international law, we need agreements and statements from the UN because that creates the consensus that we have. That's created this new framework where slavery is against the law all over the world. So in that way, they've been very successful, but they're not self-executing. They don't implement themselves. We have a new challenge of implementation. It's good to have agreement about what we want the standard to be, but at some point we actually have to take those parchment promises, those words written on paper, and actually turn them into a reality for people that are suffering.
When speaking about sort of the challenge of implementation and shifting gears a little bit to the separate roles between private and public sector, to John Yeager, in your experience, do you think that most global companies recognize the pervasiveness of human rights issues and connections with their global supply chain?
Well, I think most multinational companies do recognize the issue. To what level that they accept that, because I think it's very mind-opening to the comments that Kevin and John have mentioned, and I think it's important that that level of detail is shared. All multinational companies, my company, Toyota, we have policies and procedures and everything embedded into our companies that would prohibit these types of actions from happening, but it doesn't mean that you're going to have 100% compliance within your supply chain. So I think training and education in this area is paramount to bringing awareness to this, but then working collectively with private and public to bring more awareness to this and effective tools to eliminate it. Because we spend a lot of money daily to protect our supply chain, not only from human rights, but now we're dealing with COVID. It's even difficult now to find employees now post-COVID of coming back to work. So I think we need to work together. And I'm not an expert in these areas, and I wear two hats as a leader, and a lot of time I'm a student because I'm always learning new ways. And I'm learning a lot here from John and Kevin and their insights, which I think is very important. I don't know, not everybody has that level of knowledge that you do from the areas that you've been practicing law and defending and supporting human rights.
And so let's go back then to something that John Cotton Richmond said in his opening remarks, which I really do appreciate from a legal standpoint, that there has been this burden shift that we've been seeing, right? And so how should we differentiate the role of governments and international organizations from the role of the private sector in addressing human rights in global supply chains? And Mr. Hyland, let's go back to you.
Yes, I think it's a very important point. And I think that what we're doing in a way is obviously businesses and governments have a lot of collaboration, and economies, particularly at the moment, are very important. And we need to have good companies to give people jobs and to stabilize the world. But I think if you look at some of the, the biggest companies in the world, there is, with some of them getting so big, they become very powerful, particularly when they control information. And so some countries have got quite nervous of that. And if you look at, even the bigger companies, some of the G20 countries are, nervous about opinions, particularly governments, because elections can sometimes be in the hands of the information giants. So that then actually plays off against human rights, I think, on many occasions. And the reason I say that is if we look at online exploitation that happens, and it's a growing market, it's grown enormously, particularly through COVID, and online trafficking of children, online demand for workers. If we look back to the days when we created law enforcement, particularly in the UK, how is that paid for? Well, taxation on the public to get policing or to get other things. Where is it we're looking at these companies and saying to them, you need to make sure that your systems are free of this. You will invest millions and millions every year on designing the next, whatever it may be, charger, phone, computer, piece of technology. But how much do you actually invest in making sure that your systems are free of crime, free of child abuse, free of trafficking? And that will only happen by legislation, because I'm not saying that businesses are wrong, but we all have to make decisions. And if suddenly tomorrow they said the tax is going to go in a certain part of the world, and we know that happens in the US, some states have different taxes, and it becomes more attractive to certain businesses. And it's the same in Europe. Jurisdictions like Ireland have a lower tax threshold for businesses, so it attracts more businesses. I understand that. But when it comes to protecting children and protecting people from violence and exploitation, we do need governments to be a bit more robust and to be clear about what companies can and, importantly, what they can't do.
John Richmond, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there are different burdens to bear. Only governments can actually go in and restrain traffickers and incarcerate them, hold them accountable for what they're doing. But businesses also have a responsibility. And I think some of the burden that is being asked to bear, that businesses are being asked to bear, is fair. They have had forced labor in their supply chains, either knowingly or unknowingly. And I take John's point well, that I don't think most of these businesses want to have forced labor in their supply chain. They'd love to get it out. They just don't know how. And so I think that some of that burden they're going to bear. The laws have changed, and it's going to be required of them. And as we make that shift, I just think it's important that we continue to make sure that governments are prioritizing it for their unique and special burden to enforce the law. And so I think what many countries, particularly in the developing world, need are functioning public justice delivery systems and functioning social service delivery systems. You know, just as an example, I believe that the country of Uganda has about 300 prosecutors for almost 40 million people. It's hard with those numbers, with those ratios, and that's better than many. But it's hard with those ratios to have confidence that you're going to be able to get your case if you're in a village somewhere or you're in a smaller town and something happens to one of your family members, or you see a problem with the company you're working for, who you call out to, how you get that redressed. And so I think we need a big investment in public justice systems. And we need a big investment in the way that we are doing foreign assistance to countries around the world to make sure that those countries have the resources they need to begin to step up and improve their performance in this fight.
Thank you. And I think we also spoke about this earlier in opening remarks, whether regulation is the answer or incentives, right? And John Yeager, I know you and I have had discussions about this in the past. To you, what incentives, other than simply doing the right thing, do you think businesses have to engage in significant efforts to address human rights issues?
Well, yeah, those some great conversations we have, but going to John's point and Kevin's point, I think enforcement is very important, because one of the frustrating things is when you as a company, and no company is perfect, but you're trying to do the right things, and enforcement kind of reinforces what you're doing. So when companies are, have an enforcement action, it just helps companies who are good actors doing the right thing, because you get better buy-in. Because I always get the comments internally, it says, well, nobody else asks our suppliers this information, why do we have to do it? And then you have to go through the whole training and education of why we're asking for certain information and verifying certain informations with suppliers. So I think enforcement needs to happen more frequently where there are violations, and that is an incentive area. But I think we also need to promote and, for the good actors that are doing the right things out there, and rewarding those companies. Sometimes in social media now, the only thing that we cover is all the bad things that happen. We never comment about the good things. And there's a lot of good things still being done.
That's true. What kinds of steps, and from each of your different perspectives, and John Richmond, we'll start with you. What kinds of steps are global companies that you've seen? I know you work with many, that global companies and business groups are pursuing right now that may be innovative to actually address these problems in their supply chains?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things. But one is, I think that you're seeing a lot of companies now mapping their supply chain in a new and different way. They're taking data that they've had in the past, that's procurement data, perhaps contracts. They're going through and really figuring out 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 levels deep in their supply chain, who are their suppliers? And then they're beginning to ask questions about that to determine what are the risks associated with either a sector or a region. And then once I identify my sector and regional risks, the companies are trying to figure out, how do I weigh those risks and figure out what my response is going to be? That is do I need better contract clauses? Do I need an indemnification clause to make sure that things are okay? Or is it perhaps a third-party audit or a full internal investigation of that company? And by just asking those questions, just the diligence process, we're seeing smaller companies who want to get that contract with a big company, perhaps even Toyota. They want to become the supplier. They're trying to get their house in order from a sustainability standpoint as a competitive advantage to show a large multinational corporation that they are not going to be the problem within the supply chain. That they can both perform and provide the parts, produce, or materials, and they can do it in an ethically sourced way. And so I think we're seeing better work around the mapping of the supply chain and assessing the risks and determining where they're going to source from. One of the challenges is when companies are having difficulty finding out if there's forced labor. Like for individuals like myself who've actually worked forced labor cases on the ground, who've met forced labor victims around the world, these cases are difficult to find. And what the line is between bad working conditions and forced labor is often unclear. It's like there's often challenges in that, and it's difficult to do in a one-day audit, or it's difficult to do with just a paper review. These crimes are very personal, and we've got to look for where there are multiple indicators and keep the human touch and make sure we're actually doing quality interviews, asking thoughtful questions, and doing it in a trauma-informed way. And so I think there's a lot of work that has to be done with companies about how they're going to conduct those investigations, and then asking the remediation questions, innovations around how do we actually remediate. Does a company that finds a problem in its supply chain just cut and run, in a sense, leaving all the workers from that factory perhaps without a job? Or do they stay in a company that has some problems and work to make it better? And if so, how? And are they protected from liability while they do it? I think companies are really wrestling with these questions about how to engage and when to engage. And I think it's a challenging time to be in a general counsel's office trying to make these choices.
To John Richmond's point, and John Yeager, you brought it up on in your opening remarks as far as sharing and relying on the Department of Labor to really identify some of these suspect suppliers. Mr. Hyland, on that note, there's been a great deal of publicity about industry-wide voluntary codes of conduct. For examples are the chocolate and the fishing industries. To what extent do you think these voluntary codes are actually working?
Well, I think these voluntary codes are a significant step in the right direction. And I think when you get enough of the businesses agreeing to it, you get to a tipping point. And particularly when it's the larger companies, because I know that there has been, voluntary codes and voluntary agreements, institutes and alike, where they've come together with businesses and governments. And for example, in Vietnam, that was a negotiation to eradicate recruitment fees. And so they've brought them down significantly. Now, that was a partnership between business and other governments. And also, now working in other parts of Southeast Asia, where we're seeing, labor rights and union rights being discussed and allowed to, certain degrees. And these are all voluntary codes or voluntary practices. And it's about getting other parts of the world to understand these in a business. And a lot of the parts of the world want to do business in Europe or in the United States. And if they realize that, they've got to do these 3 or 4 things and other businesses go in and educate them, then that gives them a head start and an understanding so that they can then qualify for procurement and for government funds from elsewhere in the world. But I think people need to remember as well that, Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act in the UK was not really being supported by the government, which is the transparency in supply chain. It was business who pushed it over the line. It was actually business who went knocking on the door at the number 10 Downing Street and said, no, we want this because it gets us going in the right direction. The same with the Australian legislation. And if we look at the Liechtenstein financial sector project, which was done at the United Nations and came out with some incredible rules, that is really a voluntary code. It's not got any legislation, but there's a lot of financial organizations using that as their template. And, as we know, when you get voluntary codes, there is a point where enough businesses or enough people are following that code and they say, well, actually, the rogue ones are the ones who are making profit from bad behavior. Now we're all comfortable that this should be regulated, so it's a good way into regulation. And it can have very quick effect. That's the other thing about voluntary codes.
John Yeager, do you have experience with business, with voluntary codes of conduct in your business, and how has your experience been with that?
Well, I mean, especially in the automotive industry, I mean, there's very burdensome supplier agreements and what you have to comply with. Dealing with, conflict minerals reporting. And this has created some additional challenges because now you're creating a new pathway if you're getting a much bigger exposure to your supply chain. When you're tracing to the 3 TGs and the conflict minerals to the smelter, you're now getting visibility to companies that you never saw before. Conflict minerals has just created, open, I guess, for lack of a better word, a Pandora's box of what's in your supply chain. the closer you are to a metals producer in your supply chain, the less suppliers. But if you're dealing with electronics, you could have 50 different suppliers that made that one component all the way to the smelter. So the information and the requirements that are coming out now in the visibility of the supply chain is getting much more burdensome and getting much more visibility. We're having to do now materials management where we're having to track and identify all substances in manufactured goods in the automotive industry. And now EPA, which is creating some additional burdens that now of exploring is, they're starting to regulate substances and articles, which before they never did before. So now the supply chain mapping, as John was mentioning before, is we need the technology and the abilities to have this traceability within our supply chain, which really doesn't exist. As much as we have advanced from a technological standpoint, systems in the supply chain have not matched that growth. And it's even more frustrating that the more we advance as a society technologically, it seems to regress socially. And I'm not sure how we can level up these two areas.
Does anyone have a response to that? That's a really interesting point on social regression with technological advancement.
Well, I think it's an incredibly good point, and one that really hasn't been looked at in the way, and I suppose it goes back to the complexity of these issues, that people are starting to operate differently. Maybe in COVID, we started to operate like we did some years ago, and we went back to, we weren't able to communicate. We now like communicating again for a short while anyway. So I think those kind of things. Also, it's the globalization of trade and business has been one of the best things that's happened and one of the worst things that's happened, because we've created these very complex supply chains. We use technology like we really need that, and yet that anonymizes parts of the world. And I know that one of the biggest companies I was talking with, who everything is about technology, but when I asked them, how do you manage your staff and your recruitment in parts of the world, they said, well, we have no technology doing that. That's all done old-fashioned on pieces of paper. And yet they are a company that specializes in that field. So it just shows that there is blind spots being created just really through people not thinking far enough. But as John says, with the conflict minerals, that is opening up so much to be looked at, whether that's child soldiers, whether it's children down the mines. And of course, it's in conflict in a way, because there's a greater demand on coltan and products from mines to make batteries because of the climate change. That drive in commerce there isn't being actually looked at through lens of human rights when it comes to other labor exploitation. So that's sometimes a balance. We're not looking wider than our own particular issue. And that's something that, technology should be used for.
To take that from the other angle, though, in some ways, I think that we are more socially engaged and aware now than we have ever been. There's more information about human rights abuses around the world than ever before. I think people care in a way that perhaps they haven't in the past. Just looking at the legal framework, when we think about every country having a law against trafficking, kind of following the Palermo Protocol in the US TVPA in 2000, that's a massive shift in history. It used to be that every country in the world had legalized trafficking. It was democratically approved and religiously endorsed and culturally accepted. It's not anymore. I think we're making a lot of advancements. The challenge now is we've opened our eyes to these problems, but we're not quite ready yet to know how to fix it, how to actually make sure that every worker is being treated fairly, that they get to make the decision about whether they want to work at that place or not, that they can quit and compete in the marketplace for a different job if they so choose. Like, how do we bring those opportunities, those rights, and make sure that they're protected both from governments that are going to traffic people, as well as individuals or companies that are going to traffic people. So in some ways, I think the social awareness is positive.
To address that and to speak about sort of innovation and innovative models, can anybody talk about a cooperative effort between public and private, so government and private sector, that they have seen that they think has been particularly successful?
Well, I would suggest that the work of the Institute of Human Rights and Business, which has really worked on that issue, and bringing a country like Thailand into the debate, to the fact that they signed up the ILO protocol on forced labor. So I think that we would have thought that almost impossible 5 years ago, that Thailand would be signing an ILO protocol. Now, does it mean that they've brought it in and are following it overnight? No, but it does mean that they are starting to things like, for example, those who are in the shellfish industry, for example, it's not actually the nets for the prawns where the issues are. It's actually the supply chain of the feed for the prawns. And so they're bringing a lot of that into controlled management systems with international companies, or, for example, with some of the NGOs, and actually sending inspectors in to look at it. So I think that's been successful. And I think there's measures that have come out of that, even to the extent when COVID came in, the Thai government agreed that movements of people back into other areas would not have to happen, and that they would increase benefits for people who were vulnerable out of work, something that would never have been considered, particularly when you look at the government there and the challenges in that country. But that was all brought about by some of the biggest companies in the world working with other governments and the Thai government, and coming up with agreements that are starting to come to fruition.
I can think of a few. Yeah. I was just going to say, Renata, that I can think of a few examples. One, like the Responsible Business Alliance, the Global Battery Alliance. There's all sorts of groups, sector by sector, that have come together to try and address these types of challenges. And I think those are positive steps where I think companies are trying to figure out how to map their supply chains. And a bunch of young entrepreneurs are putting together software packages that could take a company's procurement data and run it through a series of algorithms that incorporate not just the Trafficking in Persons report, but Greta's good work in Europe, various ILO statements, sanctions lists, all these different levels of concern, to try and help develop kind of a heat map, a risk assessment tool. And these various risk assessment tools are going to take some time to mature, but they're ultimately, I think, going to be very interesting products that can help companies navigate through these laws. Another example on the primarily on the sex trafficking side, but it could be forced labor as well, are partnerships between hospital systems and law enforcement. That's where we're actually having screening done and training in hospitals for victim identification, and knowing what the signs are, and then how to report those things to the authorities or to social services to get aid. We know that a high number of trafficking victims have reported that while they were being trafficked, they received some level of medical care. And so we know that it's a high opportunity, maybe a good rate of return on that investment for training. So I think there are some partnerships between government and business in those respects.
Sarah, I want to be very mindful of time and make sure we leave room for audience questions. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you all so much. That was such a wonderful discussion, and I know we're not done yet.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Renata, and thank you, everyone. We have a lot of good questions from our audience. I will try to put a few of them together, but let's begin with one asking, what would you recommend in terms of screening policy? What would you screen for? What tools or tools or different kinds of software would you recommend? And I think that, Mr. Yeager, this goes back to something that you said about the need to screen and what businesses need to look for? Perhaps you could start with responding to that question.
Yeah, and if you're a multinational company, you're dealing with international imports and exports, you have already some responsibilities, and like with customs, supply chain security, we have developed high risk that have different factors that we're looking for, whether it's Department of Labor, red flag countries or commodities, denied card screening with sanctioned companies for various reasons. And so there are some high level things that you can screen for companies and countries, but getting into the forced labor, I don't know if there are exact tools to identify all of those bad actors within your supply chain. The other aspect that is also a challenge is technology is great, but technology is not pervasive through the entire supply chain. The farther you go upstream in the supply chain, the less you go digital to analog. You don't have the technology. The suppliers as far up the supply chain becomes less and less automated. So that is a pervasive issue. One of the funny things is probably even in third world countries, everybody has a smartphone, but the supplier in that third world country probably doesn't even have a computer system. So
Thank
those are things that need to be addressed.
Thank you. Mr. Richmond or Mr. Highland, would you like to jump in on that?
Yeah, well, I think there's things like blockchain and other resources available, but I think one of the things that we have done on these issues of human rights is that and as John Richmond said, we've got to place the responsibility. The businesses are going to have to take some of the responsibility, and I think a lot of the responsibility, because it's in supply chains, it's in the business, and we don't have the same attitude to other crimes that happen within the workplace. If there was other sort of things happening in the workplace that would affect us, whether it was in the motor industry, if cars were being made and they were defective, there would be some sanction. In fact, sometimes a whole fleet of cars will be called back, even if it's hundreds of thousands of cars, if there's a slight defect. And when aircraft create problems, two accidents in an aircraft, with the loss of 300 lives, which was tragic, but the whole fleet was grounded across the world, and it cost billions. There's 22,000 children believed to die every year in exploitative labor conditions, and yet we don't invest in the same way. We don't have the same shock and horror around those issues, and we don't know how many adults die, but we do know that many millions get hurt. So we need to wake up a little bit and not just sit back and be relaxed about it. We don't see it on other things. We see that situations have been created around the world where we see that domestic violence and other issues like that perhaps don't get the response, don't get the accountability that's there, but we never become complacent about it. We never say that by doing this piece over here or by developing a local project, that's sufficient. Politically, there's always a strong feeling about it. And that may be one of the things, that there isn't the political traction in this that there needs to be. And I think that's something, human rights sometimes isn't a vote winner. In fact, sometimes human rights can be a vote loser. So that's a problem, I think, that applies across the world.
Thank you. A related question to that is another one from our audience, and that is, what kind of systems exist for countries and businesses to share information about bad actors? I think that was a topic that came up earlier. How can governments and law enforcement agencies and different businesses, governments work together on sharing information? Ambassador Richmond, do you have a response to that?
No, I think there are ways to share information, and we're seeing the folks who are in these various associations, these sector-specific, normally business associations that want to think about sourcing. I think they're sharing information fairly well. Governments are unlikely to share information until there's an enforcement action that is actually taken. So it is easy to see who's been sanctioned for a human rights abuse under the Global Magnitsky Act. We can figure out who has a WRO against them, this company or that company. And other companies could decide not to source from those places, knowing that they're barred. But I think our challenge is not so much the inability to share information effectively, it's that there's not that much information to share. Or to put it another way, we're not identifying that many companies that are actually committing forced labor so that we could share that with others to make sure they don't source there. The real problem is a lack of identification of which companies are the bad actors, and we need to be more aggressive. And I think to do that, what we need are specialized investigative units in countries around the world dedicated, whose primary task, not their added task, not the busy folks that are doing everything else. And now in addition to that, they're the point of contact for trafficking. But to have a set of folks, and it could be in a Department of Labor or it could be in a criminal investigative piece, just people who are going out and trying to identify where workers are being exploited by traffickers. And if we would have dedicated units, we would see results. We know this. Every time that we care about an issue, we create a dedicated court or a dedicated unit. We have TV shows about specialized units. We know how to do this. It's just a question of, are we going to put the investment in? And to Kevin's point, he's absolutely right that we are under investing in the fight against human traffickers and the fight for freedom. And that needs to be reversed. We need to be countries all over the world, including the United States, which is generous in this area. We need to be far more generous. Like, we need to be on the front lines of this and tackle it like we really want to root it out.
Thank you. Mr. Yeager, did you want to respond on any with respect to sharing information among businesses?
Oh, I agree with both Kevin and John that is a very important for business intelligence, and having, if there's an information that exists, we want to have it so we can use it to make better business decisions. I think that's critical, and I agree with that 100%. We need to have better transparency and in bad actors and companies or countries so we can better police our own supply chains. And I think it's even more important for common supply chains. Should, companies that are investing hundreds, if not millions of dollars to protect their supply chain, but sharing. So you're not, because it gets down to sustainability too. If you have 1,000 companies that share the same supply chain, pulling that information together, so you're sharing that intelligence, that one, you're getting the desired effect, but you're also not losing money and revenue in doing these things. So you're optimizing your money and having sustainability and efficient processes to accomplish the same goals.
Thank you. And now the next two questions relate in different ways to size. So let me start with one that asks the question, what role, if any, do you believe stronger antitrust regulations play in mitigating human rights violations in supply chains? So that's I guess, a reference to the size of global companies, and are antitrust regulations in some way inhibiting the kind of sharing that needs to happen, or are they in some way helping?
Sarah, I'll just confess, I don't know enough about that topic to really comment on it, but it's a fascinating question. I'd love to hear what Kevin and John have to say and learn from them about that.
Well, I'm not an expert in this area too, though. Antitrust is obviously a very strong component in a lot of our agreements and relationships. So that's always very sensitive too, but I'm trying to think, how that would be an impact or benefit. I don't know. I'd be curious what Kevin has on that subject.
Yeah, a very interesting subject, and I'm not sure how directly this relates to this area, although it does. But I think if we look at similar kind of things of business investment and how businesses and how they come together, or large or small companies, I think we do place the onus on the bigger companies and how that works. And I think that there's a major role for investors to play, and that's right down to, if you look at the Delta Airline, the shareholders who forced them into certain activities as to human trafficking monitoring. So I do think that, you know, there is a role to be played across the business sector. And when we go down to smaller businesses and issues like that, well, I mean, that is an obvious thing where there is a lot more to be done, because that's where the grassroots kind of exploitation is more likely to happen.
Thank you. But just to follow up on that, another question we have about size is, what can small businesses do because they don't have the resources to map supply chains in the same way? Any comments on that?
You know, even if they couldn't do a full mapping of their supply chain, if they're a small business, they probably have a fewer number of vendors anyway. And I would think that it's just going to become common and good practice as part of diligence when there's a new supplier, a new vendor, or every now and then for existing vendors, to send them a series of questions that they have to answer, do some basic due diligence, make sure they've got the certifications and the policies in place, make sure that they're doing trainings of their employees, ask them who they're sourcing from, and just a few simple questions that aren't particularly expensive, that don't require an app or an algorithm, can begin that process. And I think it's important for companies of any size to begin to do that, so that they're ready if for one day they're acquired by a larger company that's going to want them to have all that work in order, or if they grow to a size where one of these laws will apply to them. And on that point, I think what we're seeing with coverage mandates, they're adjusting. So if we think about, you know, originally the California Act applied to companies with over 100 million in revenue. The UK Modern Slavery Act was, I think, 50 million euros. We've got 60 in Australia. We've shifted to the number of employees for the due diligence laws. I think Canada has one that's going to apply to companies with just 250 people. These numbers, both the gross revenues and the employee caps, are all going to steadily start coming down over the next several years. And so smaller companies that may not find themselves required to make disclosures at this point are going to in the future.
Thank you. I actually would like to, just on a quick point of privilege, I'd like to mention that there is an NGO by the name of Verite, VERITE, and they actually have a tool on their website that's designed to help small businesses. So something to keep in mind for those who are concerned about that. Verite and others are trying to help meet some of this need too, and do some of the things that Ambassador Richmond talked about.
No, that's good information if you can share that too, because we do
Sure.
deal with a lot of small suppliers, but also we've looked at acquiring small suppliers and doing our due diligence and mergers and acquisitions. You find all of these issues within the company especially for defense contractors and ITAR issues that they didn't realize that they needed to be doing. So, you know, that I think those types of tools are very helpful. Small businesses. I know we do a lot of coaching with our suppliers, depending on the supply chain and the types of commodities. But, you know, there are also limitations of what you can do as a company with your suppliers as well.
Thank you. And just to add a point, Mr. Yeager suggested a few websites that might be of interest to webinar participants. We will circulate those, and I'll also circulate the Verite website to everybody who's participated in this webinar tomorrow.
Yeah, just one shout out. I just would like to mention the UN Global Compact, and in the name escaping me, it's basically it's a 30-minute training on procurement, but basically for advancing the workplace, and it's really goes into the details that the procurement process could have unintended consequences of how you manage your process and your suppliers. So it's a really good 30-minute video that gives a really good exposure and sensitivity to some of these topics that we're talking about.
Thank you. Two questions that pertain to some of these kinds of issues about transparency. One audience member says, as Mr. Richmond said, transparency efforts can have the unintended consequence of laying these companies bare to litigation or driving them out of communities where they're making potentially life-saving investments. There's some in the legal community who advocate for privilege, diligence, provisional compliance waivers, safe harbors, or the like as tools for holding corporations accountable without disincentivizing due diligence and good faith efforts. Is this feasible?
No,
I think it's sorry.
I'll be quick, Kevin. I think it's definitely feasible. The question is will it be acceptable? And so right now, I think we're in a debate between human rights advocates who don't want safe harbors, in particular, they don't want to create those types of opportunities for companies. And we have companies that are trying to figure out, how do I do due diligence in a way that gets to the right ultimate end, but also protects downside liability? I don't know how that's going to work its way out. I think we did that in the employment law context, to go to like sexual harassment and employment discrimination. We did create, in a sense, an affirmative defense where if companies have trainings and they're doing the right things and they've got the right protocols and policies in place, that they could have some type of safe harbor if something comes up. It took a long time for that to mature as we developed our labor and employment law in the United States. Maybe we'll do something akin to that, but right now I see more along the sides of advocates not wanting companies to develop a safe harbor and companies looking for one.
Thank you.
Kevin?
I really, John, you've kind of answered the question in the same way that I was going to do. And I do think that it's an area where it's about the policies and the processes and the commitment. And, within the company, within things that are directly in the control of the company, we should not see exploitation, within their own walls, as it were. When it gets to supply chains, and I understand as John has explained, when you are looking at 50 different suppliers or 150 or probably many, many thousands in your company, it becomes very difficult. But if the policies and processes are there and we can see movement in the right direction, going back to what you said earlier, John Richmond, was that if we find a company or a company finds that there's exploitation there, one of the worst things they could do is to cut and run, because that would leave people in a very vulnerable situation and no work and no opportunity. If a company starts a policy or a process of improving, and we've only got to look at Bangladesh, when the Rana Plaza collapsed there, 1,000 lives lost. Some of the top labels in Europe and across the world were found in that premises. So they built back, and they built back better. And I know some of the companies there now, demand bank accounts, they make sure people are paid, and they've built schools. They've actually funded schools in the community so that future people are educated and can be management in their premises. So we can see that there are really positive things that companies can do. In the Rana Plaza, if they'd all cut and run because there was a rogue construction company, then there would have been no improvements. So I think it's a line and there's a balance, and sometimes it's a case scenario. And John as a prosecutor, me as a former police officer, we kind of think, or hopefully we do know, when people step over that line.
Thank you. It's sort of related question, cites to the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act and talks about its basis in disclosure, but notes that US law has, at the federal level, has required importer diligence since 1930. The 2015 amendment to the 1930 Tariff Act didn't create a new obligation, but it eliminated a consumptive demand loophole. And the questioner asks, are we now seeing a triad of factors, the 2015 amendment, voluntary industry agreements, and increased enforcement combining to force US businesses to develop tools to manage and monitor supply chains and to really put some teeth into that due diligence?
It's a really thoughtful question. In the 1930 Tariff Act is a great example of having a law in place that if you never use it, it doesn't have any impact, right? So we had the Tariff Act banned the importation of goods made with forced labor. It was very rarely used from 1930 really up until 2015. And the person asking the question, spot on. I remember when we were trying to get the consumptive demand exception out, it was odious, like it needed to be removed. But I didn't think it was going to make all that big a difference because no one was relying on the consumptive demand exception because imports were never being detained. It was just an ugly part of law and we needed to get it out. But I was wrong. I think just taking that exception out caused Customs and Border Protection to take a fresh look at this and feel empowered to actually begin to ban imports. And so it certainly is a good example of laws alone are not enough. There has to actually be enforcement. And I think certainly the importation bans has been part of a several new actions that are creating incentives for companies to take this more seriously.
Thank you. We'll try to get these last couple questions in here, but we'll do our best. One questioner asks, Mr. Richmond, I like the thought of changing the conversation from the trafficked back to the traffickers. What are some ways that new legislation or regulation can affect that change? And as the burden shifts from government to business, how can compliance officers add this viewpoint to the programs they're working to implement?
I think part of it is realizing that companies can act as a trafficker, just like governments can. So we have state-sanctioned forced labor. The State Department put out a report this summer listing 11 nations as being where the government itself was acting as the trafficker. Businesses can as well. And I think just realizing that, and then realizing that, as Kevin said at the very beginning, trafficking is not inevitable. It is caused by people who choose to commit the crime. And so those people might be in a recruitment office. They might be taking someone's passports when they get to their factory. They might be the ones who are engaged in these things, and they don't even think of themselves as traffickers, but they are exploiting people. And for us to begin to put the emphasis there, and I want to be careful when I say that, we want to be victim-centered as we go about this, honoring and taking care of victims throughout every phase. So we want a rights-based approach. But all the elements of the trafficking offense are about the trafficker's acts, the trafficker's means, and the trafficker's purpose. And we want to make sure we keep the focus on the trafficker so that no one moves into sort of victim blaming, that it's the fault of these workers that wanted a better life. Of course they want a better life. We all want a better life for us and our kids. It's not the fault of the workers for surrendering their passport when their supervisor told them they had to. It's not the fault of the workers for working the number of hours that they did, and making sure that we put the blame where it belongs. And I think part of that is the way we message. Part of that is the way that we train and talk about this, that we recognize that vulnerabilities themselves, poverty, lack of education, discrimination, all these things are not the root cause of trafficking. They're the root correlations to trafficking. The cause is always the company or individual or state that has chosen to commit the crime.
Thank you. We're not going to have time to get to our last couple questions, but I will promise those who ask them that we'll put them on the list for our next program on February 10th. But I'd like to ask our speakers if you have any closing remarks that you would like to make as a final statement. Mr. Yeager, would you like anything that you would like to say in closing as we complete?
Well, one, just again, thank you for inviting me to speak today. And I would actually love to get back with John and Kevin to talk about some of the things that they discussed, because as in with our company, continuous improvement, Kaizen, is something that we always do. What we do today can always be improved tomorrow. The goal of perfection is unattainable, though that's what we're trying to do. But even if it's perfect today, tomorrow it can be fixed. So I think that's one of the things as compliance officers is, we're want to spend the time, the money, the investment, the training, and education, but sometimes it's hard to find what is the effective tools to do, and not spending a lot of time and money on things that are not effective. So I think that's also helpful to know what are the right steps to be doing, because a lot of companies are trying to do and implement programs, but they may not be going about it the right way, or the tools or the processes are not the most effective. I think at the end of the day, all I care about is what works, and we'll invest in what works, but sometimes finding what works is like a needle in a haystack.
Thank you. Mr. Richmond?
Also grateful to Catholic University for hosting this. I would just say that all of us are in a journey in learning about this material and trying to figure out how it's going to function, operate. And we are all also the builders and architects of what is to come. And so I would just invite people to be engaged. Please reach out to me personally. I'd love to know what the new ideas are, or what's changing, or what's working, or what isn't working, and how we can move forward. but I think everyone needs to approach this with a level of humility because everyone is coming into this space. We're all trying to figure it out. And we have a long way to go.
Thank you. Mr. Highland?
Thank you. And it's been great to speak alongside John Yeager and John Richmond. And what I'd like to say is, I suppose, this has been a great event put forward by Catholic University. But I think it's a point that we need to remember, and it's the Pope who said, one of the biggest problems in the world is the globalization of indifference. And I think, that talks about human rights, that human rights should be about equality and about us respecting others. And that applies to big business. If you are a powerful business, if you've got the influence, if you've got the monies, and I know that shareholders are important, profits are important, but one of the things business can do is to start to look at where investment should be. But we have to remember there are priorities, and a company is going to look at its tax returns, because if it doesn't do its tax returns, it will get a massive fine. It's going to look at its, compliance that it has to do, like quality assurance, that are going to get it in trouble around litigation. And whilst I think there is a lot of effort, and I think there are very honest people, and I don't think there are many rogue people in business, but it is a priority thing. And an example I give, although it may seem very different, if tomorrow they relax the laws on drink driving and said, people disagree with drink driving, within a short period of time, lots of people who today disagreed with drink driving make a chance in a few months' time, or a year's time, or a couple of years' time. And a whole different culture would come in behind towards that, what we would see now as something as being quite abhorrent. So we do need regulation, we do need laws, but we need it to work with companies. Companies are the people who are going to deliver it. We need to empower them. And also we need to respect companies and educate and work with companies to really promote and have human rights and equality for people who are working in supply chains.
Thank you very much. And as we close today's program, I want to add one more thank you. I did not get a chance earlier to thank Alison Ussery, who works in Wales and works often with Kevin and with others. And she is just a terrific person who is very engaged in all of this work and has really helped us as we go forward developing these ideas for going forward with these programs. And in speaking about getting back together, our next program in this series will take place on February 10th. And these are all pointing towards a conference that Catholic University's Law School will hold in collaboration with Paul Hastings, and that will take place April 7th and 8th of 2022. We hope that we will really have a chance for 2 days of discussions and really have different groups and different people represented to try to move this conversation forward and try to figure out how we can all work together to improve the plight of so many vulnerable people and to bring business and the public sector together. Thank you to terrific speakers. You really added so much. Thank you, Renata, for a great job in moderating. And thanks to all of you for joining. Please keep safe and well, and we look forward to seeing you again in February and in April. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Renata.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. You're just terrific.